significant, I think, as long as the mics are working. So, thank you for coming. My name's Gerard Jones. I am a writer with an interest in comic book history, and I wrote a book called Men of Tomorrow, Geeks, Gangsters, and the Birth of the Comic Book. So I have a special interest in the early days, how comics got born in the 30s, and what happened to that first generation of founding fathers. And we have here the grandson of one of those founding fathers. This is Harry Donenfeld.
Aloha, thank you.
And his grandfather, also Harry Donenfeld, I started calling him Harry the First when I talk about it, was the principal owner, publisher of DC Comics, or what would become DC Comics, from 1938 until his death in 1965. And also of Independent News. There was a distribution company that distributed not only DC, but the Marvels of the 60s and just a whole bunch of other comics and periodicals. So he was a huge figure in the birth of comics and of pop culture in general. And so Harry, I think when we think about this, so you're the grandson of the Donenfeld.
Yeah.
I think the assumption is, well, you must have grown up just surrounded by a consciousness of this comic book empire, or a big gold statue of Superman in the living room.
Yeah, you kind of would think that. I remember when I was very, very young, we still had the legendary painting of Superman over the mantle in the fireplace in the living room, and it was a feature. And then very shortly afterwards, it disappeared. My father and mother were divorced, and that was the last time I remember seeing Superman until I was in my 20s. Yeah. And I actually grew up having, and this is going to sound strange for you guys, no idea we were in the comic book business. I grew up in a marina in Connecticut, and I frankly thought I was a boat rat most of my life.
So what happens around 1988, 89 when you're in your early 20s?
I'm in my... Batman came out with Michael Keaton, and my aunt, whom I love desperately, my father's sister, comes over to the house with a box of Batman t-shirts. And I'm looking at Aunt Peachy thinking, oh my God, my poor aunt just has literally gone batshit crazy. I have no idea why this woman just showed up with 50 Batman t-shirts, and what are you going to do with 50 Batman t-shirts? And it turns out, she looked at me and said, what do you mean you don't know why I'm carrying Batman t-shirts? And I said, well, I mean, seriously, what are you doing? And she goes, don't you know who you are? And I had to think, if you're asking me that question, no. And I was about 23 years old when they sort of informed me who I was and where we came from, and the legend of Superman and comic books and all of the rest. And from 23 on, I became the family historian, doing my homework and digging to try and figure out just who Harry Donenfeld really is.
And to add to the strangeness is the fact that your father, Erwin Donenfeld, was the executive editor at DC Comics. Yeah. Essentially ran the creative end of the company for about 20 years, right, from 1950 to the late 60s.
Never said a word.
And this too is not. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
absolutely clueless.
Yeah. And became a boat guy, became a marina. Did he own that marina?
He owned the marina in Westport from 65 until he passed away in 2003, I think.
So that's a lot for a family to hide or to close the door.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's Superman, for crying out loud. I mean, you know, everywhere you look. And by the way, I can prove this. I have been all over this planet, from Antarctica to Alaska, pole to pole, all the way around the equator. And everywhere I've gone, there he is. And if it's not the man in the S, like that gentleman over there, thank you very much.
Bizarro.
Okay. In Antarctica, one of the gentlemen at Palmer Research Base very politely said to me, without knowing anything, let me take you to the Bat Cave.
Yeah.
Seriously? And we walk over, and he's got this beautiful trailer with all his equipment in it, and there's the big bat logo in Antarctica on the side. So, you know, to know that it's everywhere and have no idea is a little strange.
So let's to solve the mystery, let me run us back very early. We do the flashback here. 1930s, Harry Donenfeld, the first, is a printer, publisher, partner in a distribution company. They do sort of cheesy pulp magazines, you know, miscellaneous other, and a lot of just print jobs too.
Mm-hmm.
They're not exactly small time, but they're not really big time.
Right.
You know, they're kind of
We're
fringe.
working it.
And one of Harry's partners is an attorney with a little family money named Paul Sampliner.
Yep.
And then another major figure in the office is Jack Leibowitz, young accountant, a guy with a strange sort of former socialist who made a major swing to all the way capitalist. And basically, I think Harry's the salesman. Harry's the guy out there making, you know, sort of bringing in the customers, bringing in the distributors. Jack's the guy in the office who's doing all the scheming.
Well, it was interesting, actually. Harry didn't have the money to pay for Superman. He, at the time, actually owned the company completely, but didn't have the cash to pay the $140 on, what was the check for? Didn't you guys see the check that went out? It's like $140. They paid $140,000 for the $100 check, which I thought was kind of interesting. And so he actually had to take Paul Sampliner and Jack Leibowitz in as partners because they gave him the $100. And that was how they became partners in the company, and we purchased the piece of Superman for that. And it cost him dearly down the road.
Now the piece, the sort of the mystery piece that I'm also talking to Nikki Wheeler-Nicholson about putting together is that company they took over had been founded by a man named Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson.
Yes.
Who, without getting into all the machinations, essentially ended up with the Donenfeld-Leibowitz combine as his printer and his distributor.
Correct.
And the trustee for the money coming in. So essentially
like
just got surrounded and then was forced into bankruptcy.
Well, from what we were told as kids, or when I started to research all of this, was that they kept putting the material out, and it wasn't necessarily making the money back. And so what happened was eventually the debt was higher than the ownership stake, and they just sort of said, thank you very much for the company. And not particularly a nice way to do things.
Yeah, and part of what would emerge as a large pattern, you know, sort of wherever Jack Leibowitz shows up, somebody's company gets taken away. And
somebody
disappear. In fact, can you tell us, are you comfortable telling us the legend, the family nickname for Jack?
Sure. Well, let's see. I'm Super Baby. Ben was my brother, was Bat Boy. So we obviously gave ourselves sort of superhero names. Jack was the Eraser.
People who worked with Jack, they didn't necessarily end up out in the weeds in Brooklyn, or there wasn't maybe that kind of erasing, but they disappear from the historical record.
Just gone.
And they disappear from the boards of trustees and any ownership in the companies they had. So we've sort of set these in motion. Now there's a dirty side to all this, which certainly facilitates this kind of business. You want to talk about, your dad told me that this fellow was his godfather. In the literal sense.
Jack,
not the Mario Puzo. But tell us who this guy is.
So Harry, Grandpa Harry was very gregarious. He was the salesman. He was never home. He was always on the road. He was always working with other distributors throughout the country and doing his job, which was just to be a relatively happy, gregarious guy. And there's some very strange stories from that. But, where was I going? I just got
We're going toward Frank.
We're going to Uncle Frank. Okay, so Harry's best friend that he grew up with was a gentleman named Frank Costello. And I don't know if any of you guys know your history a bit, but Frank was bent, as we would say. Yes, yeah, you got it. Frank worked for Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano, and he was their enforcer. And that was Grandpa's best friend for a very long time. And so we have a slight dark side to all of this and how it comes about and where people come in to play.
And there's a big, without getting too much into it, there was a big connection between organized crime and periodical distribution at the time.
Yeah.
This wasn't terribly unusual that the mob was mixed up with cheap publications and distribution.
Well, we had to get, if you think about it, we needed to get magazines from New York to Los Angeles. And in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, how was that done? Truck. Who drove trucks? Teamsters. Do we need to go farther than this?
Yeah, we can.
We can pretty much stop right there, but it did go pretty much farther.
Yeah, we can talk
an easy
about
line right there.
Newsstands as money laundering outfits, and however you want to do it, it keeps showing. It just keeps showing up. So there's this element. And tell us a little bit about your grandfather's personality and maybe why he wasn't watching the books really closely, and maybe why he was putting his trust in the wrong place.
Sure. Grandpa came over at the age of, I think it was 6, from Romania, and lived with his brothers, came through Ellis Island, sold lollipops and newspapers on the street growing up, and tried several different times at businesses, failed, had a clothing store at one point in New Jersey, and didn't do well with it. And his brothers were in publishing, printing actually. And so they finally said, Harry, you're screwing up, come work with us at Donny Press. And that was his intro into the printing world. I'm trying to think I had a...
My sense he was a salesman. He made people love him.
His specialty and his real gift at DC really was that as a salesman, he would go into a territory, let's say, I'm going to use St. Louis as an example, and he would go to the distributor in St. Louis, and it wasn't just good enough to be a friend or a business associate with him. If Harry went into a territory, he would stay with the distributor, he stayed at their house. He bought their kids cars for their college graduations, they went on hunting trips, they went fishing, and his job was he literally became a member of the family, and he made them members of the family. And in doing so, what he managed to do was secure all of DC's distribution, or national actually, it was National Periodical Publications, all of their distribution. So when a competitor would come into town and say, hey, we've got this great magazine, we want to put it up on the top shelf, the distributor would sort of look at you like, you're kidding, right? This is my brother over here, Harry, and his stuff goes on the top shelf, and if you'd like, I got a spot right over there for all the new guys. And that was part of the legend of DC, was that he had managed to become family with almost every distributor across the country. So there was no way for Dell or Gold Key or any of these other guys to try and muscle their way in. There was no way. I'm not going with you over my family.
So we've got Donenfeld and Leibowitz taking over Malcolm Wheeler-Nicholson's company in 1938. The Wheeler-Nicholson was publishing detective comics. He was preparing a comic book that would be called Action Comics that had not come out yet, and he's got adventure, it's the core of the DC stuff. He's squeezed out. Superman comes out in 1938, becomes this tremendous sensation. I think we sort of can't really grasp how big, we're kind of used to comics and pop culture at the levels we've known, but it was a huge sensation.
If you think about it, the best way that it was explained to me is we're all familiar with the Beatles, right? And rock and roll and how big the Beatles were, and we still talk about how big the Beatles were. They weren't even a fraction of what Superman did. Not even a fraction. Superman had plays, he was on Broadway, he was walking in the Macy's parade, he was at the World's Fair. Every kid, male or female, were wearing the S's and had pajamas and magazines, and everywhere you looked, it was Superman. We were getting ready to go to war, we needed a hero, and he was the man of the hour.
So the picture I get here is we got Harry Donenfeld out running around the country, drinking a great deal. Would you say Harry drank a fair amount?
Yeah, it would be okay to say that if you caught him in a room, he was probably snockered.
Yeah. So bringing tremendous amounts of money coming in, and then back in New York, we got Jack Leibowitz, kind of a gray, thin guy with a little mustache, sitting there with his green shaded lamp.
Oh yeah.
Doing the books, and
Making people disappear.
Yeah, and then your dad, who was what, maybe 20?
In his 20s. So Harry was never around. Obviously, he was out doing his thing, and he was legendarily. I'm going to come back to Dad in a minute. I mean, he disappeared once in L.A. for a week. We had to call the cops and try and figure out where Harry disappeared to. And when he finally surfaced, and we tried to get the story, they tried to get the story out of him. He kept saying he was with this French guy named Chuck Boyardee or something like that, and he couldn't remember. But he was somewhere with playing canasta or pinochle with this Chuck Boyardee. And it turns out that wasn't even close. He was at the Beverly Hilton poolside with Charles Boyer, and he spent the week underground in Los Angeles, and for all we know, Marilyn Monroe got a visit from him. But that was more along the lines of what Harry was doing. He was out working, sort of.
So in his way,
in his own
bringing
way.
things in. Meanwhile, Jack's
Yeah.
sitting there with the ledger books.
And Jack is, how come you're out having fun and I'm doing this?
And I think Leibowitz had, in a sort of a non-creative but business way, had a lot to do with the shape of DC in the 50s and 60s.
Well, yeah, absolutely. He physically ran DC. Jack, when became National Periodical Publications, Harry was running the distribution side because he was always on the road doing the sales. And so Jack actually took over the position of running DC Comics. And so when he did that, he had my father, Irwin, as the executive vice president or editor-in-chief. And my father worked directly for Jack, was trained by Jack, and much to his dismay, he considered Jack more of a father figure than Harry. Jack was around, Harry wasn't. Harry was doing his thing. He would come home, give you a big, "Oh, good to see you," and off he would go. And Jack was the one who was stuck doing the day-to-day stuff in the store or in the shop, and so that was the person that Dad interacted with more than anybody else.
And you told me that your grandfather trusted Jack enough to make him the executor of his...
Yeah, so in the list of terrible things that have happened along the lines of Superman, Jack Leibowitz was made the executor to our estate. And so when Grandpa passed away, Jack realized that he owned everything. It was all his. He had full control of my father, all of his assets, everything, plus everything he already owned. And so the actual takeover of DC occurred on that day. The minute Harry passed away, Jack had already put into plan how he was going to go get DC Comics. It took him about 2 years, I think, to put it all into place. And when we merged with Warner Brothers and took over Warner Brothers, my father had to vote his shares. He had 52% of National Periodical Publications, but Warner Brothers was a much larger company, so he would end up diluting his shares by purchasing it. Jack convinced him to vote his shares to a lesser stake because he would become the president of Warner Brothers. Jay Emmett would be the vice president, and Steve Ross would be the CEO. Irwin agreed, voted his shares with my Aunt Peachy. We purchased Warner Brothers. The board met the first day and threw him out, right there on the spot. He was president of Warner Brothers for about 15 minutes, and that was it.
And rolling